Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening everyone. We are from first group of language testing. Let me introduce myself. My name is Oktavia Susanti T and my partner is Mega Octa Setyawatie, Lolyta Febriyanti and Anggi Suyitna. And we will talk about testing, assessing and teaching. My presentation consists of the following parts: opening, what is test, assessment and teaching, approaches to language testing, current issues in classroom testing, and closing. What is test? A test, in simple terms, is a method of measuring a person's ability, knowledge, or performance in a given domain. And the component of this definition is: the first, a method. It is an instrument, a set of techniques, procedures, or items that require performance on the part of the test taker. To qualify as a test, the method must be explicit and structured. Multiple choice question with prescribed correct answer, a writing prompt with a score rubric, an oral interview based on a question script, and a checklist of expected response to be filled in by the administration. And second one, a test must measure. Some tests measure general ability while others focus on very specific competence or objects. A multi-skill proficiency test determines a general ability level. A test measure. A test measures an individual's ability, knowledge, or performance. Tester needs to understand who the test takers are. What is their previous experience and background? Is the test appropriately matched to their abilities? How should test taker interpret their score? A test measures performance, but the result implies the test taker's ability, or to use a concept common in the field of linguistic competence. Most language tests measure one's ability to perform language, that is to speak, write, read, or listen to a subset of language. On the other hand, it is not uncommon to find tests designed to tap into a test taker's knowledge about language. Performance-based tests sample the test taker's actual use of language, but from the samples the test administration infer general competence. A test of reading comprehension, for example, may consist of several short reading passages, each followed by a limited number of comprehension questions, a small sample of a second language learner's total reading behavior. But from the result of that test, the examiner might infer a certain level of get lateral reading ability. Finally, a test measures a given domain. In the case of a proficiency test, even though the actual performance on the test involves only a sampling of skill, that domain is overall proficiency in a language, general competence in all skill of language. Other tests may have more specific criteria. A test of pronunciation might well be a test of only a limited set of phonemics minimal pairs. A vocabulary test might focus on only the set of words covered in a particular lesson or unit.
Now let's get into the next part, assessment and teaching. The first one, what is assessment? Assessment is the process of documenting knowledge, skills, attitude, and belief, usually in measurable terms. The goal of assessment is make improvements as opposed to simply being judged. Are assessment and test the same thing? We might be tempted to think of testing and assessing as synonymous terms, but they are not. Tests are prepared administrative procedures that occur at identifiable times in a curriculum when learners master all their faculties to offer peak performance, knowing that their responses are being measured and evaluated. While assessment, on the other hand, is an ongoing process that encompasses a much wider domain. Whenever a student responds to a question, offers a comment, or tries out a new word or structure, the teacher subconsciously makes an assessment of the student's performance. Tests then are a subset of assessment, actually. They are certainly not the only form of assessment that a teacher can make. Tests can be useful devices, but they are only one among many procedures and tasks that the teachers can ultimately use to assess students. In an educational context, assessment is the process of describing, collecting, recording, scoring, and interpreting information about learning. Informal assessment can take a number of forms, starting with incidental, unplanned comments and responses, along with coaching and other impromptu feedback to the student. Examples include saying nice job, good work, did you say can or can't? I think you meant to say you broke the glass, not you break the glass. Or putting a smile on some work. Informal assessment does not stop there. A good deal of teachers' informal assessment is embedded in classroom tasks designed to elicit performance without recording results and making fixed adjustments about students' competence. Examples at this end of continuum read marginal comments on papers, responding to a draft of an essay, advice about how to better pronounce a word, a suggestion for a strategy for compensating for a reading difficulty, and showing how to modify a student's note-taking to better remember the content of a lecture. On the other hand, formal assessments are exercises or procedures specifically designed to tap into a storehouse of skills and knowledge. They're systematic, planned sampling techniques constructed to give teacher and student an appraisal of student achievement. Is formal assessment the same as a test? We can say that all tests are formal assessment, but not all formal assessments is testing. For example, you might use a student's journal or portfolio of materials as a formal assessment of the attainment of certain course objectives, but it is problematic to call those two procedures tests. Tests are usually relatively time constrained, usually spanning a class period or at most several hours, and draw on a limited sample of behavior. Another useful distinction to bear in mind is the function of an assessment. The two functions are commonly identified in the literature. The first one is formative and the second one is summative assessment. The first one is formative assessment, aims to evaluate students in the process of forming their competencies and skills with the goal of helping them to continue that growth process. And the second one is summative assessment. It aims to measure or summarize what a student has grasped and typically occurs at the end of a course or unit of instruction. Actually, both assess learning and both are used for feedback, and also both are used for future planning. But actually, there are some differences about them. The first one, we can we can make it clear by asking three questions. When do we do it? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? The first one, when do we do formative assessment? It is done throughout the course, while summative assessment, as I mentioned before, it is done at the end of the instructional period. And then why do we do it? Because for formative assessment, because it needs to identify gaps and improve learning. why do we do summative assessment? It is just to collect evidence of student knowledge, skill, or proficiency. And then how do we do formative assessment? It is by approaching that support specific student needs. And then how do we do summative assessment? It is by uh, quizzes or observations or periodic review tests, midterm tests, or final exam, and a general and a course and general proficiency exams are examples of summative assessment.
Approaches to language testing, a brief history. Historically, language testing trends and practices have followed the shifting sands of teaching methodology. In the 1950s, an era of behaviorism and special attention to contrastive analysis, testing focused on specific language elements, such as the phonological, grammatical, and lexical contrast between two languages. In the 1970s and 1980s, communicative theories of language brought with them a more integrative view of testing it, in which specialists claimed that the whole of communicative event was considerably greater than the sum of its linguistic elements. Clark, 1983, page 432. Today, test designers are still challenged in their quest for more authentic, valid instruments that simulate real-world interaction. Discrete point and integrative testing. Discrete point tests are constructed on the assumption that language can be broken down into its component parts and that those parts can be tested successfully. These components are the skill of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and various units of language or discrete points of phonology, graphology, morphology, lexicon, syntax, and discourse. Oller in 1979 argued that language competence is a unified set of interacting abilities that cannot be tested separately. His claim was that communicative competence is so global and requires such integration that it cannot be captured in additive tests of grammar, reading, vocabulary, and other discrete points of language. Others, among them Zico in 1982 and Savignon in 1982, soon followed in their support for integrative testing. What does integrative test look like? A closed test is a reading passage, perhaps 150 or 300 words, in which roughly every 6 or 7 words has been deleted. The test taker is required to supply words that fit into those blanks. The ability to supply appropriate words in blanks requires a number of abilities that lie at the heart of competence in a language: knowledge of vocabulary, grammatical structure, discourse structure, reading skill and strategies, and internalized expectancy grammar, enabling one to predict an item that will come next in a sequence. The second one is dictation. Essentially, learner listen to a passage of 100 to 150 words read aloud by an administrator or audio tape and write what they hear using correct spelling. Communicative language testing. Bahman and Palmer, 1996, page 9, include among fundamental principles of language testing the need for a correspondence between language test performance and language use. In order for a particular language to be useful for its intended purposes, test performance must be correspond in demonstrable ways to language use in non-test situations. The problem that language assessment experts faced was that tasks tended to be artificial, contrived, and unlikely to mirror language use in real life. Weir in 1990, page 6, noted integrative tests such as clause only tell us about a candidate linguistic competence. Performance-based assessment. Performance-based assessment of language typically involves oral production, written production, open-ended responses, integrated performance across skill areas, group performance, and other interactive tasks. Learners are measured in the process of performing the targeted linguistic act. A characteristic performance-based language assessment is the presence of interactive tasks. A prime example of interactive language assessment producer is an oral interview. The test taker is required to listen accurately to someone else and respond appropriately.
Current issues in classroom testing, new views on intelligence. Research on intelligence by psychologists like Howard Gardner, Robert Sternberg, and Daniel Goleman has begun to turn the psychometric world upside down. Gardner, 1983-1999, for example, extended the traditional view of intelligence to 7 different components, accepted the traditional conceptualization of linguistic intelligence and logical mathematical intelligence on which standardized IQ tests are based, but he included 5 other frame of minds in his theory of multiple intelligences. The first, spatial intelligence, the ability to find your way around an environment, to form mental images of reality. Second, musical intelligence, the ability to perceive and create pitch and rhythmic patterns. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, fine motor movement, athletic prowess. Interpersonal intelligence, the ability to understand others and how they feel, and to interact effectively with them. Intrapersonal intelligence, the ability to understand oneself and to develop a sense of self-identity. Robert Sternberg, 1988-1997, also charted new territory in intelligence research in recognizing creative thinking and manipulative strategies as part of intelligence. All smart people aren't necessarily adept at fast, reactive thinking. They may be very innovative in being able to think beyond the normal limits imposed by existing tasks, but they may need a good deal of processing time to enact this creativity. Other forms of smartness are found in those who know how to manipulate their environment, namely other people, debaters, politicians, successful salespersons, smooth talkers, and co-artists. And con-artists are all smart in their manipulative ability to persuade others to think their way, vote for them, make a purchase, or do something they might not otherwise do. Traditional and alternative assessment. Traditional assessment. One shot, standardized exams, timed, multiple choice format, decontextualized test item. Scores suffice for feedback. Norm-referenced scores focus on the right answer. Summative, oriented to product. Non-interactive performance, foster extrinsic motivation. Alternative assessment. Continuous long-term assessment. Untimed, free response format. Contextualized, communicative tasks. Individualized feedback and washback. Criterion referenced scores, open-ended, creative answers, formative, oriented to process, interactive performance, foster intrinsic motivation. First, the concepts in the table 1.1 represent some overgeneralization and should therefore be considered with caution. It is difficult, in fact, to draw a clear line of distinction between what Armstrong 1994 and Bailey 1998 have called traditional and alternative assessment. Many forms of assessment fall in between the two, and some combine the best of both. Second, it is obvious that the table shows a bias toward alternative assessment, and one should not be misled into thinking that everything on the left-hand side is tainted, while the list on the right-hand side offers salvation to field of language assessment. Ashburn and Hudson, 1998, aptly pointed out, the assessment tradition available to us should be valued and utilized for the function that they provide. At the same time, we might all be stimulated to look at the right-hand list and ask ourselves if among those concepts there are alternative assessments that we can constructively use in our classrooms. Computer-based testing, a specific type of computer-based test. A computer adaptive test has been available for many years but has recently gained momentum. In a computer adaptive test or CAT, each test taker receives a set of questions that meet the test specification and that are generally appropriate for his or her performance level. The CAT starts with questions of moderate difficulty. A test taker answers each question. The computer scores the question and uses the information, as well as the responses to previous questions, to determine which question will be presented next. As long as examiners respond correctly, the computer typically selects questions of greater or equal difficulty. Incorrect answers, however, typically bring questions of lesser or equal difficulty. The computer is programmed to fulfill the test design as it continuously adjusts to find questions of appropriate difficulty for test takers at all performance levels. In CAT, the test taker sees only one question at a time, and the computer scores each question before selecting the next one. As a result, test takers cannot skip questions, and once they have entered and confirmed their answers, they cannot return to questions or to any earlier part of the test. Computer-based testing, with or without CAT technology, over these advantages. Classroom-based testing, self-directed testing on various aspects of language, vocabulary, grammar, discourse, one or all of the four skills, etc. Practice for upcoming high-stakes standardized tests, some individualization in the case of CAT, large-scale standardized tests that can be administered easily to thousands of test takers at many different stations, then scored electronically for rapid reporting of results. Some disadvantages are present in our current predilection of computerizing testing. Among them, lack of security and the possibility of cheating are inherent in classroom-based, unsupervised computerized tests. Occasional homegrown quizzes that appear on unofficial websites may be mistaken for validated assessments. The multiple-choice format preferred for most computer-based tests contains the usual potential for flawed item design. Open-ended responses are less likely to appear because of the need for human scorers, with all the attendant issues of cost, reliability, and turnaround time. The human interactive element, especially in oral production, is absent.
Okay, that is all from first group. We would like to say thank you for listening our presentation and thanks for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.